So for recording, we will be recording this session for those who can't make it or for you to rewatch this later. Recordings will be available for up to 30 days when put up. We are pinning the video so that only the presenters will be recorded. This means you can choose to keep your video and audio on or off. If you speak, the recording will pick your audio and not your name. You can type your questions in the chat box if you prefer, and depending on the presenter, you can private message them as well. Please keep your audio on mute whenever you are not speaking, otherwise we might pick up your background noise. We encourage you to check our Sugar and Spice Facebook group for latest updates and announcements. As for consent, please do not contact other participants outside the festival without their consent. You can always ask them for permission through the festival or Facebook group before messaging them. We do not want instances of participants feeling violated or unsafe. We do have some emotional support for you. So for emotional support, please email us at emotionalsupport@sugarandspice.asia. So for this session, it's about living the dream, fantasy versus reality, the BDSM lifestyle. And Karen Evers-Foo will be conducting this session. Karen is an intuitive life coach. She works with individuals who seek to regain control over their lives, empowering them to lead more fulfilling lives. Her well-rounded holistic approach includes both conventional and spiritual therapies that result in deep and powerful transformations of the person's body, mind, and soul. She holds a BA in psychology from Syracuse University, New York, with over 20 years experience in the corporate world, working with leadership on employee relations and recruitment. She received certifications in counseling and personal assessments and development tools. She is also well versed in various energy and emotional healing modalities. She is a plus size community ambassador and an advocate and coach with the alternative lifestyle community within Asia. She currently resides in Bangkok, Thailand. So Karen, I'll leave it up to you for your session. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for the introduction. Well, good evening, everybody. It's a Friday evening, so hopefully this will be worth your time for a Friday evening. So what I'm going to be talking about today is something that was, I was motivated to write and talk about this particular subject matter, especially since I watched the whole 50 Shades of Grey, and I'm sure most of you, or many of you anyway, have watched the entire trilogy. And what was frustrating for me was that a lot of people had a lot of misunderstandings, or they thought that whatever they saw within 50 Shades of Grey was real, as in it was complete reality. Most people tend to forget that it is a piece of fiction. And even though a lot of things in there were somewhat accurate, certain principles that they showcased in that movie or series of movies were actually not quite accurate. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding by people, a lot of people, even those who are in BDSM itself, to think that that's how the way things work. They forget that when you're writing fiction or you're in a movie watching fiction, there's a such thing as a willing suspension of disbelief. So that the story is a much more romantic, it flows easily, etc., but it's not necessarily grounded in real life. So I decided to write up about this subject matter. And for today's presentation, I had to sort of shrink it down a little so we can fit it within the 1 hour span, and hopefully have some spare time to answer some other questions as well. Feel free to enter all your questions in the chat box. Fiona will be monitoring those for me, and I will be sure to answer them towards the end. All right, so let's begin. I will share the screen. So in the BDSM world, whenever if you were to actually attend at munches and so forth, munches are basically gatherings that people who are in the BDSM community, they tend to meet, usually at some public place where they go to socialize in public. And oftentimes you hear about, wanting to find someone who would be my long-term partner. If I can even marry my long-term partner and has the same kinks as I do, that'd be so fantastic, right? And I read somewhere that it's like living it 24/7 all the time, and it's my absolute dream. And to be able to marry somebody in the lifestyle is an absolute dream. So what I want to do today is to debunk a lot of the myths that people have about living the lifestyle 24/7. And so here it is. So let's get going. Right. So since the audience is a rather large and diverse, possibly diverse group of people, I thought best to have a trigger warning here that this discussion will involve, or this presentation will involve very frank discussions about BDSM and sexuality. Now, even though it's not going to be graphic, it can be triggering for some people. So the main idea here is to increase awareness. But bear in mind that this doesn't necessarily cover every single aspect and variations about BDSM. Okay. So what is BDSM? For those who are not familiar or don't quite know what BDSM is all about, they only hear about the 50 Shades of Grey and stuff like that. So what exactly is it? So we've got different acronyms for the BDSM. So usually a typical definition for the B in BDSM is bondage, D for discipline, domination, S for submission, sadism, and slave, M for masochism and master. So this is why sometimes when you see these acronyms, people can get confused. I thought it's supposed to be this, this, and this, but someone else says, no, it's this, this, and this. So these acronyms can be used for various different descriptions. And so, but this is basically what it covers, okay? So they're all within the same spectrum for the different letterings. So the other question that a lot of people tend to ask about BDSM is that, is it really just a lot of kinky sex, or is it just a fetish? Or is it really sort of a lifestyle? In fact, most people will just ask if it's really just kinky sex and fetish, not realizing what is it really all about. So in the BDSM world, this here, and then you have kinky sex, and then you have fetishes. So there are some overlaps in these areas where some people who have kinky sex will have an element of BDSM. People who have fetishes may also have some elements of BDSM and vice versa. And then those who are living the lifestyle, so encompassing all that there is within all the overlaps as well, within BDSM, they are then living the lifestyle within the BDSM framework. So what that means is that they don't just play and role play, they actually live it by principle, with BDSM as a principle and foundation in their lifestyle. So what are some commonly held myths? One of the myths that I often hear about whenever I meet people who are new to this community, they tend to ask, is it, am I like this? I like BDSM. Is it because I had some childhood trauma or some sort of abuse? Is that the reason why I'm so perverse? And sometimes in Chinese, the word 变态, which means, in other words, is perverse. So in actual fact, BDSM has come a very, very long way in terms of being misunderstood And there was a survey, or rather, there was a paper that was written up in Australia based on the data that they collected. And this is a reference for those who are interested to actually read up the paper itself. The details are just here. And what this thing has done is that this paper has disproved the fact, right, that is not, there's no direct connection caused, so BDSM is not necessarily caused by history of abuse or trauma. And the fact is that for those who practice BDSM, they will practice it regularly, let's put it this way, not new practitioners per se. Those who are already more experienced practitioners, they would tend to be less neurotic, more extroverted. They're more open to new experiences and conscientious, less rejection sensitive, and have higher subjective well-being. So this is another quote as well, based on regarding the myth that it is a pathological symptom of past abuse or difficulty with normal sex. So a lot of people tend to say, well, you can't have normal sex because you're so perverse. Or you were raped when you were a child, you were sexually abused when you were a child, or you were sexually abused even as an adult. And so they tend to think that then they can only then express themselves in this weird, perverse ways. But this particular paper has said completely otherwise. And similarly, it was a proper scientific paper, clinical paper that was written up that proves it otherwise. So for those who are interested in this paper, they can actually go in and actually read the paper and get information for themselves. Some of the other commonly held myths. The dominant partner is the one in control and has all the power, and that the sub just obeys and accepts everything the dominant demands. Sub meaning the submissive person. That seems to be the pervasive, very commonly held idea that the dominant partner is always the one in charge. They can stomp all over you and step all over you and demand this and demand that, and the other person just has to give in. The reality is that the dom is doing things too, or requiring things of the submissive that the sub actually wants and is willing to provide, right? The power of control is not one-sided. It is actually a 50-50 split in terms of the control. The power is still held between both parties, with each being able to activate the safe word. Oftentimes, many people tend to think that safe words are something that only a submissive will use to stop whatever is going on, right? Whether it's during a play session and things get a bit too much, or they want a clarification about certain things during the play session, and so on and so forth. And that is only a word that the submissive can use. In reality, the dominant can also use a safe word when the dominant feels they want to make sure that the submissive that they're with are okay, that they're comfortable still to go on further, or to even just stop and say, let's talk about this a little bit more. I think maybe we shouldn't go as far. How do you feel about it? Before they restart or completely stop. So most people don't see that particular aspect. They think that the dominant has to say all and be all, and the submissive is only can use safe words just in case they get into danger, right? The fact, people think that is also very abusive because of the fact that a lot of people tend to think of BDSM as something that's whips, chains, pain, and so on and so forth. That a lot of it is pain related, and that is a lot of impact play. Impact play usually refers to using whips, canes, bondage, and so forth. That I think is a very abusive, cruel thing. In everyday life, I suppose, in regular or non-BDSM lifestyle, this would be considered very, very abusive. However, within the BDSM community, we practice safe, sane, and consensual. And we have that as one of our mottos, things that we live by and should live by. So what that translates to is that we encourage both parties, the dominant and the submissive, to consent, to have consent after a detailed discussion, right, as to what boundaries and physical or psychological safety boundaries should be, and what are some of the critical things that they are willing to do and not willing to do. And so any experience of pain or humiliation by the submissive usually would have been already pre-negotiated, and is a safe, positive, erotic experience for both parties. Now, I say that it is pre-negotiation. This is under the assumption that both parties are experienced and both parties have had clear communications and detailed communication as to what is okay and not okay. So if it's going to be humiliation, what kind of words can be used, what kind of actions are still okay, what is something that I cannot take it at all, right? Please don't say something like this, or please don't hold me this way. And so all this has to be pre-negotiated ahead of time. So very high level communication skills need to be employed during these negotiations before playtime. There's another, a lot of people tend to also think that BDSM is always about kinky sex. It's not just kinky sex. It's not always kinky sex. It is something that a lot of people think that happens all the time, right? And that it is something that it's the only thing that they do. But the fact is that BDSM is about sensations, about pushing personal boundaries, exploring the power dynamics. So the dynamic of controlling, being in control, accepting control, surrendering, and so forth, for the submissive as well. So sexual acts can be part of the scene, but it's not necessarily so. So they have been, oftentimes BDSM practitioners, and actually a lot of clinicians as well, they believe that it is only about kinky sex. Right, that is and that is the subculture of kinky sex. But in actual fact, that sometimes and oftentimes in a BDSM session, there's no sex involved. There have been maybe some touching, in terms of maybe even using an instrument to prod at or to just tap at the genitals, but sometimes there's no genital touch whatsoever, right? There could be no penetration. The activity or the session will not have any sex whatsoever. Okay. In fact, sometimes I'd rather not have sex included in there, because then it crosses that boundary for that particular couple, that it goes into a different realm of, or different aspect of the relationship they have. So, however, for sexual BDSM, it is centered mainly on emotional and mental experiences. And I tend to perceive sex as being centered on physical experience. Sexual BDSM experiences are as facilitating deeper interpersonal connections than those available in sex, because of the amount of communication and between both parties, between the dominant and submissive. Detailed discussions need to be had, so that, first of all, obviously also for safety reasons. Second of all is to make sure that you don't cross any boundaries that either parties are willing or not willing to cross. And so because of that, of the higher level of connection, if when they do have sex, the intensity, the connection level between both partners when they're actually having actual sex, they tend to be a bit more deeper in terms of emotional, mental, intellectual intensity. And this is also something that was noted and researched on And as early as, or as recent as 2017, there was a paper that was written. In fact, this was actually pretty much paraphrased from that paper. So if you want to read it up, the details are here. What are the commonly held myths? BDSM practitioners in a long-term relationship, they only have kinky sex, right? Isn't that what they're supposed to do? You know, since they're already kinky anyway, aren't they always having kinky sex? That's the assumption, right? For most, there is often an element of the dominant submissive play during sex if it's not a full-on play session. When I say play session, I often means that they're actually enacting out or playing out a BDSM scene. For those in a long-term relationship, they also have vanilla sex. So it's not as if they're constantly only having BDSM sex, kinky sex, you know, or having, that's all they do is have BDSM sessions. A lot of the long-term couples also just have regular, normal, vanilla sex. So they are like regular people too. Myth. A person who's dominant or submissive in real life would prefer a similar role in BDSM. That is very, very commonly held misbelief, right? A myth. They think that just because you're very dominant in day-to-day life, and therefore, you know, in personal sex life, you have to be the dominant. You know, your power and control needs to be always, you know, in place. It always has to be shown, and so forth. And those who are submissive in real life, day-to-day life, they always will be the mousy little one and the one that's always willing to serve and be on the knees, etc., etc. When in reality, it's actually not true, not all the time. There will be those who are the alpha types. They tend to, yes, most of them will tend to fall into the stereotypical roles, but I've seen more than enough people who don't. In fact, a lot of men that I work with, who are particularly in power positions in companies, they really hold very senior posts in the companies. They hold a lot of power within the organization. They are very, they have massive businesses, they're business owners, and so forth. Sometimes it is those who are the ones who prefer to be submissive in their personal life and in the bedroom, right? And then there are those who are the really mousy types. And it's not just referring to only the females. There are lots of males too, who prefer to, who in real life are very submissive and very quiet and very demure and docile and sensitive and so forth. But during their personal lives and especially in the BDSM relationship, they can often be very, very powerful dominants. Because if anything, they understand what is it like for the other side of the coin. Same for those who are the alpha males or alpha females in the workplace, because they understand and appreciate power. They know what is it like to wield power. And therefore, when they submit to another person, it's a very, very conscious submission. And so they tend to also be very wonderful submissives as well. They are then able to, oftentimes what they say, what they tell me is that they're so used to, there's so much required of them during the daytime at work, where they have to be alpha male, alpha female. They have to make decisions all day long. They need to ensure this and the other is going on. They're responsible for a lot of people, a lot of work. They're responsible for the P&L of the company, etc., etc., etc. When they come home and with their personal lives, with their partner or spouse, they can just say, poof, I let that go, right? I don't have to think anymore. I can just submit to my partner and let my partner make the decisions for me based on what's already pre-agreed. And I can just then relax. I can just relax. I can then just be who I am. I can be quiet. I just do as I'm asked to, and that's it. I don't have to think too much. So the stereotypes that people have about the fact that, you know, if you're an alpha, you can only be a dom, it's just not true. So for those who have already been practicing BDSM, often the next step is something that not many people know exactly what to do. So if they found somebody you'd like to spend more time with and go into a relationship or a more formal relationship, what do they then do? There are a few things that they can do. So what I'll be covering next will be the meaning and significance of collaring and what that entails. I will also talk about the various forms of collaring rituals, both the old school and the modern. And I will also talk about specifically the importance of contracts. Contracts are something that a lot of people don't realize that is actually good to have in place in a BDSM lifestyle, and I'll talk to you about it further later on. What to expect in a long-term relationship in terms of the real-life practical terms, right? So master-slave relationship. So for those who are in a dominant submissive or master-mistress / slave relationship, what does it mean in a day-to-day life, right? When you are together day-to-day. And also how to manage and raise children while being in such a relationship. This is based on what I've written about the long-term relationships. My reference point is for those who are in a hetero relationship. For those who are not in hetero relationships, the principles still remain. So it depends on how you want to interchange the nouns and pronouns and so forth, but the principles remain the same. The other thing is how to manage outsider perception. Most people don't realize how others may perceive you if you were to be in a long-term BDSM relationship. So, what is the significance of collaring? When the dominant and the submissive, or the master and slave, wish to affirm their relationship in a more formal way, they often choose to have a collaring. So the collaring is a common ritual that is done within the BDSM community. It formalizes the relationship. So it's almost like saying to the community publicly that we are together. We're officially together as a couple. We're together. We have a formal relationship. So it also means that anybody else back away, unless there's a different agreement between the couple. And so it's a very formal situation. One thing I do have to caution for those of you who are already in this BDSM community and you are looking to be owned, please do not rush into finding or assuming or confirming an ownership status with somebody because you feel lost without one, or they have a fear of being alone. Similarly, for the dominants and the masters, mistresses, it's not wise as well for them to, out of desperation, they want to take on a particular submissive or slave, just so that they feel good about themselves and so forth. Usually, as I said before, the formal relationships can be between a dominant submissive, and it can be between a master, mistress, and slave. So in the community that we have, there's some discussion and debate as to how formal is one relationship or one form of collaring compared to the other, and how that ties in with titles. So the way that is often done, it's not necessarily for everybody, but for most communities, when you have a dominant who takes on a submissive and they are in a formal relationship, it's similar to that in the vanilla world where we say, okay, you're my boyfriend, you're my girlfriend, you're my partner, and so forth. It's sort of like a girlfriend, boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, boyfriend kind of situation. So it's sort of like a boyfriend, girlfriend level where he says, yeah, we're going out together. We are formally going out together. We're dating, sort of equivalent. They're sort of spending time together to see if they can be in a long-term relationship together, right? So there is still some sense of they are attached to each other already. Whereas for a master mistress slave relationship, that is really the one of the highest level of commitment, whereby there is a discussion between both parties and have enough time spent with both parties to finally understand what the dynamics of the relationship is going to be like, and that they're comfortable with the power exchange between both parties to go on 24/7. Right, so they can agree, they have to discuss and agree as to what the master or mistress can or cannot do, what the slave can and cannot do, what are off limits. Like, for example, for many of them, work life stuff is off limits, meaning you don't disturb them at the office, you don't just suddenly appear at the office, etc., etc. No phone calls, no text messages. If it's some emergency, maybe then, I suppose, but it really is all subject to what the couple decides to agree upon, right? So, but the primary focus in a master-slave relationship is to allow for a more stable and safe environment for the slaves, and it allows them to then feel more secure, so that they don't have to constantly worry, am I doing this to please my master or mistress? If not, if I upset her or him, then does it mean I'll get kicked out? Like, they're going to break up with me, and so forth. So when they decide to go into a master-slave arrangement, then it really gives the submissive a lot of freedom and the stability to be able to feel that they can be their own person as well. So in terms of collaring rituals, one thing I want to mention before that is that I'll use a comparison for dominant submissive. When they have a collaring ceremony, it is that to affirm that they are equivalent of the vanilla Wells boyfriend and girlfriend, or maybe a little bit engaged, sort of in between. But when it comes to the dream, which is to be in a master slave or mistress slave arrangement, that is the dream. That relationship is often seen as the equivalent of a wedding, a marriage. The commitment level is there, if not more. So if you look at that in terms of the differentiation, there is much more commitment level when you have a master slave collaring. And the thing is that the reason why I bring this up is because oftentimes, even people within the community, they tend to use these words interchangeably. It doesn't really then denote as to whether or not how formal is a relationship, how tight the relationship is, and to what extent does this relationship go to. Sometimes not. Others may not accord them the level of respect, especially for the submissive, if the person is not in a slave state already or not. So there's a differentiation there. The fact is that people use those terms very interchangeably is something that is, it happens very often, but it's often for amongst those who are not, who don't have a full understanding or grasp as to what collaring really is all about. So in terms of old school and modern types of collaring, so as I said, it's sort of like a for the dominant and submissive collaring ceremony, so sort of like a coming out ceremony. For those who are in a master or mistress slave kind of relationship ceremony, it is similar to that of a wedding. So some people prefer different types, right? They prefer more traditional type or more elaborate, very fancy with lace and doves and, or some people go with the full regalia of leatherware, and so forth. Some will have very solemn wedding affairs type style. So like a formal ceremony with an officiant, and then have a reception after the ceremony. Sometimes they have very formal vows that each party writes up. And then make that vow in front of everybody to the other person. All right. So sometimes they will have certain songs played, certain poetry read. It's almost like a typical wedding. It's just that there's a slightly different tweak to it. Sometimes, as I said, they can wear very elaborate wear, but sometimes this may choose to have the submissive be in their birthday suit, as in like no clothes whatsoever, as to further denote their submission, if they wish to. So sometimes they'll have special invitation cards, like wedding cards, right? You have them all customized and so forth. You have it as a special venue, maybe a place where they first met, or they might even book out a suite in a hotel or resort, depending on how much money you want to spend. And then also sometimes they have like equivalent of like wedding favors. You actually give special souvenirs to those who actually came to witness that particular ceremony. Some people, however, prefer less, wah, wah, wah. They prefer less pomp and circumstance. So they prefer something simple, they kept between themselves. It's only between the two of them that they make this agreement. Sometimes they might make their vows and promises to each other in private, and they may then sign their contract together and exchange a collar of sorts. Right? It's a very private affair. So it can be the variety of the variations rather is as many as what the regular mainstream vanilla wedding would be like. It's all customized to what the couple wants. Collars, they can come in different styles and different forms. The stereotypical collar people think of is like similar to that of a dog collar, like a pet collar with a nice little buckle here. And then sometimes during playtime, they might change it to one with all the spikes and one with all the rings and so forth. So this is very stereotypical that you see in mainstream media. And what happens is that it's not always necessarily the case. Typically, both parties would choose the style of the collar together, especially since if the person is, the submissive is going to be wearing the collar all the time. So some may have, they may choose to have a private collar. Sometimes they have a public collar. Because sometimes the private collar, the one they wear all the time, it might be very delicate. And so to use it during playtime may not be appropriate, it might damage it. So they might then they may choose to have a separate collar that's used specifically for playtime so that it's then more sturdy, right? So that's a choice that the couple can make as well. And not everybody has a formal collar per se. There are so many different designs available right now, and a lot of them look like jewelry. So these jewelry, they tend to look a bit more discreet. Some of the jewelry looks less discreet, but unless you're in the lifestyle, it would be hard for you to recognize them. And so for those who require or who wants to have discretion, they can use different forms of jewelry to denote that they have this formal collaring ceremony already. Some of this jewelry are very obvious symbols within the community. Others are very discreet. So this is a symbol that is often used in the BDSM community as well. This is the symbol that represents BDSM. The whole heart locket thing, it became mainstream for the last few years now, that people tend to wear these as a fashion item, not realizing that it's actually also something to denote ownership. Sorry, is there a question that came up?
It's okay, you can continue.
Okay, so Fiona, we're still good? Yes?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so, right, sorry. So that's one of the jewelry. So this locket, for example, we often use it as a necklace. I've seen so many variations of this love locket that people like to wear as just fashion jewelry. But the origins is that for those who are within the BDSM community. The other one is something as simple as this. It could be a bracelet that has some significant symbols on them. Or it could just be a simple bracelet that has got some inscriptions on there. To have like a private message between both parties, or have both parties' initials engraved on there. And so the message that you engrave in there will just be very, very private, something that only both parties would know what it is and what it means. So there are different varieties. Some people like to go to more old school. Especially for those who wish to have a master mistress slash slave kind of relationship. Some will even have tattoos put in place, especially if they know that the commitment is very stable. Right? They may have had a collar before, but maybe it's not convenient to have a collar. Or a bracelet to wear because maybe it breaks off too easily, or it shows up too much under the clothes when you go to work. So some may then have discrete tattoos or piercings put on there to denote the ownership. Some will even do brandings as well. For those who want to do more old school in terms of the ceremony itself, some might actually then choose to do the rose ceremony and the blood ceremony. This is what in the old school world, we tend to look at this as the most highest level of commitment to each other. So the rose ceremony is a ceremony whereby both parties present each other with roses. So the submissive will present a white rose to the dominant, and the dominant will the white rose will still be only maybe slightly open. The red rose, however, from the dominant is a fully bloomed red rose, and they exchange the roses there to denote that the giving of each other. And then what some will do then is take a piece of leather thong or ribbon, and then they'll tie both of the roses together by the stem to signify that they're both bound together already. For those who go one step further is to have a blood ritual where there is a symbolic pricking of the fingers or cuts on the hand to let out blood on both parties. And then they can then either smear the blood on each other's hands, right, to affirm that they have both exchanged bloods, or for those who are doing a rose ceremony, they can then drop their blood or rub their blood onto both roses to signify the bond that they offer, that they want to have. So it's akin to like a blood bond. So something that's not going to be easily broken whatsoever. And it's for those who have felt that they've really found the life partner. So contracts and legal concerns. Normally, contracts are something that not very many people think about and practice because one, they think it's a pain in the ass. Why does it need to be so formalized, right? Must I spell everything out? I just do whatever I want, and if the person wants to do it, that's fine. The contract actually, when preparing the contract for both parties, it sets up the foundation or sets up the precedence for the couple who wants for them to have basically a better communication, for them to be very open to talk about what is it that they want, what is it that they need, what is it they're willing to do, and what are they not willing to do. What are some of the soft limits? What are some of the hard limits? Like hard limits as forever is a no-go, right? Like for example, like bloodletting is no-go. Playing with it, including children in play, for example, is a no-go. Some people say no scat for sure, and so forth. So you actually write those limits down. And soft limits, whatever it is that they are okay doing, but they're not sure how far they can go. So then they can say, maybe for a soft limit, I'm willing to try out and see how far I can go doing this particular activity, and we'll slowly do it and slowly progress in terms of that. So bear in mind, this is not just necessarily for the submissive. This is also for the dominant. The dominant can also insist on certain limits, certain boundaries that the dominant also will not go and will not do. So when both parties actually then talk about what is it that they are willing to do and what kind of responsibilities they want to take up for each other, they can, right? In fact, the more is discussed, the better it is. The more details that's included in the contract, the better. And the reason why it's a contract is because then is a document that both parties can then refer to and look at, and to remind each other as to what is it that agreed upon, what is it that they have decided to do, not to do. And then also, as part of the whole communication thing, it then also allows for both parties to review that document regularly. Just like having a work performance review, right? You have a relationship review. And even in vanilla couples, it is something that I will often recommend that my clients do as well. It's always good to check in with your partner every once in a while to make sure, hey, are we okay? Are things good? Is there anything we need to talk about? Is there something that maybe we both need to adjust, etc., etc., and have that kind of conversation, just so that we can course correct when it's still early enough, instead of letting things fester and grow badly, and then things go kaboom, right? They fall apart. So once you have a very clear-cut document, and when you have a very clear definition as to what each party's roles are going to be like, and what each party is going to be responsible for within that particular relationship, then that way there's a sense of security and stability for both parties as well. So when you feel more secure and feel more stable, you then feel more freedom to do, to play around, to expand, to explore, and to grow together, because then you know where the clear-cut boundaries are. Sometimes these contracts can also be very good in terms of determining, for example, how you would like each other to engage with other people, right? This one tends to be a little bit more on what the dominant would prefer that the submissive do, usually, but not necessarily always the case. So, for example, if they were to go meet up with a group of people who are from the same community, for example, are you then, is the submissive, for example, allowed to speak to others? Or do they need to seek permission before they speak to the other person? So a lot of people might think that that's something that dominant is trying to assert the dominance and control over the submissive. But sometimes the submissive actually wants that, because they may feel maybe the type who are very socially awkward. And so having that rule or that instruction might actually make them feel safer. That then they don't have to be awkwardly talking to people that they feel awkward talking to. And so they can then always then defer is whether or not my dominant is comfortable with me talking to you or not, right? And so you also do have sometimes other dominants who may not be very ethical, and they'll start pursuing this particular submissive, even though the submissive may already have an obvious collar in place, etc., etc. So having this rule or having this arrangement is then very beneficial for the submissive to be able to say, I need to talk to my dominant first to see if the dominant is okay and comfortable with me talking to you. So it doesn't always seem like, it is the dominant who's putting all these rules down on the submissive just for the sake of doing it, okay? And also in terms of how to engage people who are not from the community, people who are regular, vanilla people, how do you then want them to, how do you want to be how do you want to engage with people from the vanilla world, so to speak? So do you then tell them right up the front that, you know, that you guys are in a BDSM relationship and that you're collared, or do you just want to just say, oh, we're dating, we're going out, and so forth? So these kinds of conversations need to be had as well. In the contracts as well, you can also identify limits, where areas could be areas for stretching growth. So this will be good for both parties in terms of growing their abilities and so forth. Because sometimes BDSM couples, they also, just like regular vanilla relationships, you have those who have very, very experience in love, and there's those people who have no experience in love or relationships, and then you have those who are at the dating at 40 or in this relationship only at 40, and you have people who are in a relationship at 18. So there's always bound to be growth and development, personal development as well. And those are areas that can be identified as well. Legal concerns. Legal concerns is something that most people don't think about so much, but only when situations arise. Like, for example, rape accusations. There have been instances where I've come across where because of some emotional games that were being played, or not even emotional games, it's just that the other person is being abusive, where there's no consent to have sex, where sex was forced. It wasn't a consented play rape or rough play. And when there's no clear consent, then rape accusations can come about. So if in the legal documents, in the contracts, it's spelled out very clearly that if you both choose to have rough play or to have play rape scenarios, that it is agreed or not agreed upon. And what are some of the safe words they can both use to denote time out, stop, and so forth. Or even if they have agreements in place and the safe words are already in place, but when the safe word wasn't used, or if the safe word was used and ignored, that is going to still be an issue as well. So for those who do decide to get married as well, if one of the partners is asexual, or if one of the partners is undergoing chastity, based on the vanilla world in terms of marriages, legal marriages, that can be grounds and basis for divorce, right? Because there's no consummation of marriage, there's no actual intercourse that happened. And so does that means that if both partners decide to part, or one partner decides to part, that then this non-consummation of the relationship, will that mean that, you know, it's grounds for divorce, right? So in terms of the contracts, then if it's spelled out very clearly that there's going to be chastity in place, or that there's asexuality in place, that it be all spelled out as these are both agreed terms, and not necessarily because there is no consummation, because there's no consummation. It was something that was part and parcel of the BDSM dynamic that they choose to have. So that's one of the things that you need to be concerned about. Legal access when one is incapacitated. So just like in the vanilla world as well. So if unless you're married, the other person, your partner, then the spouse will then have access to power of attorney, right? Medical power of attorney as well. So it's usually a spouse that has it. But if they are not married, but they are in a formal master-slave relationship, formal dominant submissive relationship, and there's a contract in place to state that should either one party be incapacitated, as in like maybe they're in an accident, they're in a coma, they are unable to make decisions anymore, they become like a vegetable. If you have documents in place to say that the other person, the partner, has rights to access the medical records or to approve surgery and so on and so forth, those documents need to be in place. So that then at least that you can still access them, even as simple as seeing them at the hospital. Because if usually only family members are allowed to visit, well, friends too during visiting hours. But if you're talking about in situations where the person is really like an ICU or something like that, they usually only allow family members. So if you are not exactly a family member, as in you're not a spouse, then you have no access, right? So that's when documents come into place. So these kind of contracts can be binding depending on which country you're in. So it's also good to engage a lawyer to formally draw up these documents. And not only drawing it up, but also upon signature to have it notarized at the same time. So that's all witnessed and signed and so forth. And so in not very many countries will recognize it per se, but at least if there is at least a document there to say so. If you want to go to court to fight it out, you still have some leg to stand on to fight it out. It's also good to have that because some family members may not be aware as to how serious your relationship is, right? Especially if you're not married. So they don't know who you are to that person. As far as they're concerned, you're just a girlfriend, so what? Or you're just a boyfriend, so what? And so if with that kind of document, you can then use that as a basis to go to that family member and say, I'm actually, given permission to be part of the aftercare or to be part of the decision-making process, et cetera, et cetera. So in situations, there's going to be times where in any relationship, right? Breakups can happen, right? Divorce can happen, breakups can happen. So when you rescind the collar or when you decide to file for a divorce, if the couple has children, either they have shared adoption, or these are natural born children, maybe from previous marriages or from current marriage relationship. These kind of contracts need to be in custody arrangements and who has what right to which child, depending on whose child it is, or if it's a child that they had together, how would they then move forward in the future? Should anything go wrong or sideways, what can they do to do the best for the children? Right. So for couples who've been together for a while and they have shared children, it is a conversation that needs to be had, so that at least that way in the future there's no issue, especially when it comes to there have been cases where they'll use the fact that the person is in BDSM. And so accusations of, they have sex orgies, they are abusive and so on and so forth. All that will be used as grounds for gaining custody over children. And that kind of manipulation is to me, I personally think it's very unfair. If both parties are involved in that relationship, in a BDSM relationship, both parties already have known what each other do. So, but there can be situations where manipulations of that sort happens.
Sorry, Karen. We are almost 8 o'clock.
Okay, so I'll go through the rest a bit faster. So what to expect in a long-term relationship? So a lot of people tend to think that dominance and submissive are always on intense mode. That means the button's always on, right? But the reality is it is not. For those who live it as a lifestyle, the roles are always in place, as in a dominant submissive roles are always in place, but it's not like an extended play session at all times. For those in the relationship, for those in the lifestyle, really, they are really basing like everybody else's relationship. It's just that the dynamics, the foundation of BDSM is in place. So if anything, the relationship is maybe a more heightened level of vanilla relationship, because I like to think of it that way. But they look like anybody else walking the street. How we show up, interact with the other person and connect to them helps them to figure out how to live their day-to-day life in their relationship. So sometimes it cannot be so obvious, right? So what we can then do is to choose certain words or facial expressions or certain actions, because then it will help to also give the other person a sense of stability that, even though we're out in public, I just want to let you know that our dynamics are still there, right? So it's also then important, just as in vanilla relationships as well, how you engage your partner in terms of, how you say things, how you look at the person, etc., etc. So if sometimes certain actions or certain expressions or certain words are not are used during the interaction, sometimes it may trigger the other person. And that's why it's very important to have all these discussions to build that relationship, that trust, and also just awareness as to what would be trigger points for the other person, right? So because of the fact that BDSM, one of the principles that we ought to live by really is to have frequent discussions and communication, so that all these things are always discussed ahead of time, so that the other person can then be more aware and be more conscious of not saying or doing triggering things. And this is not just only for the submissive, but it's also for the dominant too. Trust building communication is not just the responsibility of the dominant. The submissive also just has as much responsibility. So both parties need to take responsibility. As mentioned earlier on the slide, it's a 50-50 situation. Both parties need to be responsible for each other and for themselves. So even if in the contract is already pre-agreed as to what the roles are like and so forth, misunderstandings can happen because sometimes your definition of something may not be the other person's definition of the same thing. So it's good to have regular discussions and spell things out. So like, for example, what is integrity? What does it mean to obey? What does it mean to, what does it mean when you say, you know, for example, I expect you to sit, right? What does that mean? So it's also critical here that for both parties and for submissives, especially for this, it's still very, very important for the person to maintain a sense of self, because the person will still have to interact with everybody else in the outside world. Right? Especially for the submissive, if they were to just give their all and just hand everything over to the dominant and expecting them to just lead their lives for them, they in the end are going to be completely reliant, and it can be very, very exhausting for the dominant. And then they also no longer know how to deal with people in the outside world. So it's not a very healthy thing to do. You still need to maintain a sense of self. Just as in regular relationships, you still need to maintain a sense of self. Not many people will understand what lifestyle is all about, and people tend to make assumptions based on what society deems to be normal and what's right. So be prepared to be judged from different people from different angles, and include feminists, anti-feminists, gender supremacists, even doctors, therapists, religious communities, and conservatives. They may say that from a moral point of view is wrong, or for the feminists, against those who are male dominant, female submissive, they could say, we've worked so hard for women to be able to come up, you know, and be an equal in society, and here you are still being so submissive to a man. Things like that will be said nowadays, actually, and very often so as well. So sometimes the people who you may least expect to react, the other ones who react the strongest. So sometimes, especially for those who enjoy impact playing, it's very easy to have bruises, scratches and stuff like that. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's deliberate. When other people see these bruises and marks, they may be very concerned that, are you being abused? Is your partner abusing you? And sometimes even strangers. Sometimes whatever it is you're wearing so happen to have exposed a certain bruise, for example. Sometimes a stranger might actually come up to you and say, are you okay? Do you need help? You can just nod your head and I'll take you to the police station so you can file a report, etc., etc., etc. So it's sometimes very difficult to say, it was consent. I consented, right? It's in BDSM, I consented to the play. So sometimes it's hard to explain. Okay, so there we go. One thing that's also very important for those in the lifestyle as well is that if you don't feel particularly submissive or dominant that particular day because of family stress, the work stress, and so forth, it's fine. There's no need to be constantly on all the time. Right? There's no need to be constantly submissive all the time and be serving and so forth. In day-to-day real life, you can't expect that button to be on at all times. Everybody has their own emotions and feelings and they process them differently. So if they suffer from depression, for example, it can be very challenging too. So it's important to be responsible yourself, regardless of dom or sub. So even when you have fights or arguments, you still need to be responsible for the things that you do say, right? You don't have to allow yourself to be manipulated to do something, even if it's if whether you're dominant or submissive. Sometimes a lot of submissives, it's a sad thing to hear, but a lot of them, just because they want to please or they want to serve so they can be loved more, they will bend over backwards and do things that the dominant wants, right? And sometimes these dominants may not be necessarily a good person. So they may ask you to do something illegal. And sometimes they may manipulate the submissive and say, if you love me, you'll do it. Or, you're my submissive, I'm your owner. You should do as I tell you to. Instances like this, especially when something illegal, something that goes against your own moral values, don't do it. You still have a choice, right? You still have a choice not to do it. Raising a family, it is challenging, especially when you are in a BDSM lifestyle. It's challenging in terms of what kind of values you want to teach your children, right? So definitely you cannot play or have very obvious power exchanges in front of the children. Of course, you definitely do not have play sessions in front of the children. But the thing is that you still need to teach them, for example, manners, right? So even between a dominant and submissive, you could still have manners. You can still have speak properly. You can still speak respectfully. You can both have a separate understanding. And like, I may ask you for a cup of tea very nicely, and I'll say please and thank you. It doesn't mean that it's a request. It's an order, right? It's a command. So, but the thing is that all those words don't need to be said. It can be pre-agreed, and then you just go ahead and do it. Most children will have no clue. Even right now in our Asian society, we still do have a lot of female-led relationships, like matriarchal societies as well as patriarchal societies. So that you can still play within that and keep to a very normal image as a family. All right. One thing good about being in a BDSM relationship and having children is that because in a DS relationship, you do need to have a very heightened sense and level of communication. So when you practice that, you also then tend to practice similar levels of communication with other people. And that is a skill that every child could use. And so it's a good benefit to be able to have your children be able to communicate their needs and their wants in the future. Personal time. I would say personal time, keep it all to the bedroom. If not, go on a little staycation somewhere and play. Definitely no play in front of the children. That's understood, but sometimes some people don't understand that. So especially if it's a humiliation play or impact play, sometimes the children might see it as abuse, and they think that it's perfectly acceptable to be abused. Especially if they're younger children and they don't understand, or you have not told them that you're in a BDSM relationship. All right. So there are many ways to engage with your partner in terms of showing a little of the BDSM or the SM lifestyle in non-obvious ways. Like, for example, you can easily be putting a hand at the back of the neck and giving a certain type of squeeze, or you could be I'm pulling on that person's ear, outside, just playfully and pulling a person's ear, but in actual fact, maybe it's already agreed that that person is. When the ear pulling is happening, it's actually to symbolize that the person is actually pulling on the genitals or pulling on the nipples. It could be various things. But as far as the kids can see, or the public can see, only your ear is being pulled, which is a very non-obvious way. All right. So keep all interactions PG in front of children. As I mentioned, manners is very, very important. Acts of service can always be explained as a demonstration of showing love and appreciation. Right. So objectification, however, is a different story. You don't want to exactly see a parent of acting out being a table or a chair. I don't think that that is very inappropriate in front of children. However, serving the dominant is perfectly acceptable, especially if they have children together. It's just the submissive showing care and love and concern for the other partner. Outside perceptions, I think that's as I mentioned early on, between feminists, people who are morally just and so forth. There's also issues with male toxicity as still a subject that people talk about currently in the media. For a lot of men, who toxic masculinity is still very much an issue, especially the submissive men. So it'd be good for the couple to arrange, to have a discussion as to how they want to deal with that. So especially if the woman is the dominant one, and a lot of people, especially here in Asia, would then often say to the man or the submissive man, "Man up! You know, you're being whipped. You know, such a wuss, right? How can you let a woman, dictate everything for you? How can you be the one serving the woman when the woman should be serving you?" Especially here within Asia. So the male submissive will then get a lot of flack for doing so, and then for the female dominant, they will also get a lot of flack for not being feminine enough. You're not doing your job as a wife, etc., etc. So there's a lot of this you need to manage ahead of time and discuss how is it that you want to explain this to people around you, if they're worth explaining to, especially family members and friends. I would caution against publicly just telling everybody that you are in a BDSM lifestyle, right? Because not everybody is open and willing. Some people who say that they're very liberal-minded and so forth, they may be liberal-minded and they think that they're very, very open, but not necessarily extended to as far as BDSM. Unless you really know and trust the person very, very well, by all means, it's still the couple's choice. But I would caution against being very casual in terms of announcing to the world what your relationship is like, because there are going to be people who are going to condemn you because of the fact that a lot of people still think that BDSM is a perversion. Okay. First, the other one important thing is that sometimes in the workplace it's a bit more challenging. Sometimes the bosses may not be too open-minded or even can understand what BDSM is all about, and so they project their fears again upon the BDSM couple, and they may actually then have their job at risk, right? Because it doesn't reflect the company's rules and values and so forth. And so they decide that based on that, you have to leave. So be very mindful as to whom you actually talk to and tell about your relationship statuses. There have been instances where people can be also verbally and physically violent because they feel threatened by your weird perversion behavior based on their ideas as to what BDSM is all about. Or for religious persons, sometimes they feel that it's a moral justice, right? That from religious perspective, what you're doing is wrong, it's condemned wrong, and that was a massive sin, etc., etc. And so there will be judgment of it around. Still, sad to say, but you need to prepare ahead of time between both parties to know exactly what to say should the situation happen, or what not to say to let other people know about your relationship. So there we go. That was a bit rushed.
We just have one quick question.
Sure.
Does this mean it is possible for asexual people to engage in BDSM without kinky sex?
Yes. Yes. Sometimes there's no sex involved whatsoever, right? Sometimes it's just depends on what kind of play. Like, for example, if the couple likes to engage solely in bondage play, for example, or impact play, then there's no sex.
Okay. Thank you so much for Karen. It was quite interesting and in-depth for this.
I'm sorry, I didn't have the chat box open, so I couldn't quite see what was going on.
It's okay. We just have one question. Anyway, yeah. So that's it for today's session, for the 7 p.m. session. For emotional support, please email us at emotionalsupport@sugarandspice.asia. And there is a feedback form I've posted in the chat box. Please, those who are watching, please fill in the forms. Okay. So we're going to be on a quick 15-minute break for Dr. Martha's session on sexual AIDS in 15 minutes. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.